there. Happy Sunday morning to you. It is Dr. Gilchrist with a finishing up of attribution theory screencast for social psychology. I wanted to get this in yesterday. I kind of had a little on my plate, so I wanted to make sure I got this out as soon as possible so that you would have time to listen to this before our review session for the exam tonight. So the last time we were here, we were talking a little bit about the fundamental attribution error, which is basically the idea that we tend to overestimate the situation for ourselves when we do something unexpected. And for other people, we often tend to overestimate disposition or personality traits, and we tend to underestimate the situation. Now, to go back to why we commit the fundamental attribution error, here are just a couple of quick reminders for you. First of all, other people are really salient. We don't necessarily see the whole causal chain of a situation that would enable somebody to act the way that they do. All we can really go off of is people and the behavior that we see. And so when we see something unexpected, we don't necessarily see the chain of events that might have led to somebody performing that particular behavior. We just see the person. And because of that, we are more likely to make that causal dispositional attribution. In general, personal attributions are very easy to make. In fact, there's a lot of evidence out there that we make them automatically. Now, some people will start with a personal attribution and they will occasionally try to adjust and take more of the situation into account. But the problem with that is that that adjustment occasionally takes effort. If you're too busy, if there's just too much on your plate, if you don't have enough time, if you're tired, you're not really going to engage in that adjustment. And what we tend to find is that in general, we are a lot less likely to blame ourselves for our problems or for our failures. So humans tend to commit what we call a self-serving bias. And this is basically the idea that when we fall short of our goals, or when we don't do well in something, or we fail to succeed, we're going to make attributions that help frame us positively. So for many students, for example, a self-serving bias or a self-serving attribution would be, after failing a test, instead of saying something like, well, I didn't study nearly as hard as I could have, I didn't spread out my study time between my classes, that would be kind of a personal attribution. We tend to make situational attributions. The test was too hard. Um, the test was too hard. The questions were too difficult. My instructor doesn't like me. So all of these things that could be used to explain away your failure that really have nothing to do with you. And in general, we tend to find that we are going to make personal attributions for our successes. I did well because I work hard. I did well because I studied hard. I did well because I'm talented. And we tend to make situational attributions for our failures. This was too hard. It was too difficult. This instructor is biased against me, and things like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about both individual and cultural differences in these attributions and in person perception. And in general, one of the things that we find is that most of us do not all perceive the same people the same way. You are a unique human being with your own ideas, your own perspectives, and your own experiences. And as such, you're going to bring your experience to every person perception. And what this means is that odds are pretty good that you and a friend may not perceive a third person quite the same way. And we know that there are several different factors that can vary across perceivers. So for example, the cognitive accessibility. So there are certain traits, there are certain things that are going to be more readily accessible for one person versus another. There's something called a need for cognition. So some people that have a high need for cognition are really going to want to try to figure out why people do the things they do. And so those people are going to be more likely to make certain types of attributions because they're curious. They want to figure out what makes people tick. They want to understand how other people think. And somebody with a low need for cognition, they aren't really bothered by how other people operate. They're not really curious about that. And as such, they're going to be a lot less likely to make those attributions. Now, one of the other ways that people can differ is what is occasionally referred to by people like Carol Dweck as having a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And the idea here is, do you believe that people can change, or do you believe that people and their traits tend to stay pretty constant over time? So a fixed mindset would be, this person has these traits, they're not really going to change all that much, versus somebody who has a growth mindset who believes that people can change, people can learn, and people can grow. And interestingly enough, there was a recent study that came out. The way your particular belief about whether people's traits are fixed or whether they can change does affect how you treat other people. And this has some pretty interesting implications. So this came out maybe about a week or two ago. I thought you might find this pretty interesting. It's going to take some time to load, apparently. Oh, come on now. Of course, my Wi-Fi is not nearly as good as it is at Cotty. But here's kind of the headline. Teachers' beliefs about the nature of intelligence affect minority students' STEM grades. So here's what the research kind of said. This was a major study that was performed. In a study featuring more than 15,000 students, the racial achievement gap in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics was found to be twice as large in courses taught by professors who express the latter attitude. So professors' beliefs about the nature of intelligence are likely to shape the way they structure their courses, how they communicate with students, and how they encourage or discourage students' persistence. So people that tend to have more of a fixed attitude, generally we're going to find that that gap is a little bit larger. So here's kind of what we find. Is student ability fixed or malleable? IU researchers found all STEM students and especially underrepresented minorities perform better in growth mindset classes. Fixed mindset professors believe that students can't change their intelligence, sends messages that only innately gifted students can succeed in class. The results are lower motivation, poorer grades for all students, and larger racial achievement gaps. For professors that have a growth mindset, they believe that intelligence can be changed, sends the message that there are strategies that students can use to succeed. The result is higher motivation, better grades, and smaller racial achievement gaps. When students have growth-minded professors, they are more likely to feel motivated to do their best work, believe that professors emphasize learning and development, and recommend the class to others. So here you've got a STEM grade GPA. You can definitely see for somebody with a fixed mindset, there is a considerably larger gap. Now, whether or not that is significant is another matter. I'm assuming it is, or else it wouldn't be published. But this is a really good and recent example of how a fixed mindset affects how you approach situations, how you approach people, and because of that, you end up treating people differently. Now, are there larger cultural differences? And we do tend to find that there are. If you look at largely individualistic cultures, like here in the United States, we tend to find that attributions are generally going to be more likely to be dispositional in nature because, well, power of the individual, right? On the other hand, we do know that for collectivist cultures, we are going to see a greater likelihood of situational attribution. Now, one of the things that we do find, and this is something I want to spend some time on, is that attributional styles can actually affect your mental health. In particular, depression, which is probably the best example of this, can very largely be affected and furthered and worsened by a particular attributional style. So I want to talk a little bit about explanatory styles. How do you explain away something when things don't go your way or things don't work out? You get rejected for a date, you don't do well in school, there's an award that you wanted to get and you didn't get it. How are you going to explain this? And there are three different dimensions of an explanatory style that will affect how you end up feeling as a result. So again, we can kind of make an internal or an external attribution. So did this happen because of something internal in me? Is it my fault? Or is it something out in the environment that caused this? Is it external? Then we have stable versus temporary. So this is kind of similar to a fixed versus a growth mindset. So by stable, is this something that I expect to be permanent? Is this something that will never ever change? Or is this something that's temporary? Is this something that will go away with time? Is it unstable? Will it change? And then we have global versus specific or local. So global, is this problem that I have indicative of how I am doing in general in all aspects of my life? Or is this just confined to a very specific area and it really has no bearing on everything else that's going on in my life? So here's an example of what I mean. So we tend to find that for people that have depression, they tend to operate with an internal, stable, and global outlook. So here's what that looks like. If something bad happens, it's my fault. I'm a failure. And it's stable. I'm always going to be a failure. And it's global. I'm a failure in everything I try. I can't do anything right. Now, on the other hand, let's take the flip side of this. External, temporary, and specific. So it's external. This happened because there were a lot of situations in my life that caused some problems. It's not anything specific to me. Rejection happens to everybody. It's temporary. This won't last. I'm not always going to fail at this. I will get better when I try. And then specific. Maybe I'm not really doing well in my math class, but I'm doing well in my other classes and in my extracurriculars. You can kind of see that internal, stable, and global, how it just makes you feel worse. So we do find that a negative attributional style is internal, so it's my fault, stable, it will always be this way, and global, I fail at everything I try. And this can lead to a sense of what your textbook refers to as learned helplessness. Now, this was originally studied by Martin Seligman, looking at dogs that were exposed to inescapable electrical shocks. And what he found is that when the dogs couldn't escape, once they were actually given an opportunity to escape, they would just lay on the floor and they would cry. Now, obviously, this doesn't really happen with humans, but we do find that when humans are exposed to uncontrollable stressors, and especially if they have this negative attributional style, they're going to feel like, why should I bother trying to change my circumstances because it never works out for me anyway? And this has the unwanted effect of furthering the cycle of depression. You have this negative attributional style, it makes you feel bad, you engage in behaviors that push other people away or make your depression worse, you fail, you attribute that with your negative attributional style. Now, one of the other things that we might do if we're worried about our performance and if we're worried about failure, we might engage in what is referred to as self-handicapping. So has there ever been a test or a paper that you were really worried about, you knew you weren't going to do that well on it, and instead of kind of making an effort and trying your best and possibly being open to the idea of trying your best and failing anyway, you ended up staying up all night watching Netflix instead of studying? This is what's referred to as self-handicapping. There is nothing scarier than trying your best and failing anyway. And some people are so terrified of that that they actually try to create situations where if they do fail, well, it wasn't their fault. They were up all night watching Netflix. And that's what self-handicapping is. But one of the things that we're going to find is that too much positivity doesn't really help either. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. This is the last slide, and I'll talk about this in the next few seconds or so.